Hello and welcome to MIP TV, and with me as always is Bob Cook. I'm TA Made Simple, and today Bob is going to be talking about a specific technique in therapy. It's called the parent interview, and this is decontaminating the parent's ego state. Would that be correct, Bob?
In a way, it leads, yes, in a way. As I was talking earlier, a couple of videos about decontaminating, teaching the client when they're a parent, when they're an adult, when they're a child, and dealing with contaminations. And I followed that on with how you then work in, the operational technique of deconfusing the child ego state. And now we have to talk about how we deal with the parental introjects, and the toxicity of the parent, which is often the cause of many of my clients' distress, actually. So we can't, how can I put this? The child always comes with the parent. So we have to talk to the parent, and there's a specific technique in TA, specific to TA, called the parent interview I'd like to address.
Okay. So what I'm getting from this is that, TA is parent, adult, and child. And sometimes, in the last video, we talked about how people may bring their child ego state with them. Correct. But Correct. This is specifically how they may bring a echo of their parents.
Correct.
And I'm guessing you're going to explain how you get them to see themselves as themselves without the kind of shadow of their parents being cast on them. Would that be?
That's right.
Okay,
that's
Bob. Oh, yeah, that's not bad.
That was fantastic. So as I said, following from last time, the last video, if you like, I was talking about how we deal with the child ego state and their own child distortions and delusions and the inner child work. But with the child ego state comes the shadow of the parent, just like you described there. And we need to address the toxicity of the parent. So quite often as a TA therapist, you may teach them, like I said earlier on, about their parental identifications and how sometimes they may act out as their parent, their parental introjects. So they go through life, as if they were the caricature of their own father or mother. When that is happening to the extent the child becomes squashed, or the child in the client, because it's the client we're talking about, in real life feels diminished or has a lack of self-esteem because the parent is always bearing down on them, we need to talk, or we need to address that particular parental interject. So this technique I'm going to talk about here is called the parent interview. But I do have a sort of really important warning, if you like, here. That this really needs to be done when you know your client. So if you're going to actually say, do a technique I'm going to talk about now, which is a parent interview, where you put the mother, father, or the significant caretaker onto a cushion, or ask the client to role play that parent, you have to have a very strong working alliance with the client, and the child needs to be strongly attached to the child ego state. And you need to know that client before you ask them to play, role play, touch on, whatever way your words you want to look at this parent that we're talking about. That's a very important caveat. So you need to have worked with them at least, I think, 6 to 9 months in therapy.
So the clear indication I'm getting here, Bob, is that it's how the client is attached to the therapist, a working alliance, and the repatriative element within the relationship where the client trusts you to be able to take you to places which are really historically difficult, and not only trust you to take them there, but to bring them back.
Correct. So we're talking about protection very, very strongly. So when we're talking about these clinical nuances, and specifically the parent interview, we're talking about clinical protection. In other words, the therapist, that's yourself, stands in between, how can I explain it, the parental introject and the child. So I'm putting my hand up, the therapist's parent ego state is stronger than that destructive parental interject of the client. That's very, very important. And you would not do this parent interview unless you knew you were stronger than that parent. In other words, if you feel scared around the client for some reasons, or you feel uncomfortable about the parental interject, you wouldn't do this work, because you have to be able to provide the protection to ask the client to role play the parent that's been so toxic.
What are the dangers for the therapist in this? We hear a lot about the client, but what are the dangers for the therapist when they literally take on the historic parent?
Well, of course, okay, it's a very interesting question, because we are concentrating on the dangers for the client in terms of protections. But you see, I think the therapist who takes on the parent and the I need to backtrack. I think the danger for the client is they get the therapist is that they get caught up in their own counter-transference, and they end up coming from a child ego state rather than an integrated adult or a strong parent.
Yes. So what can happen is it sounds like the toxic parent actually kind of could attack the therapist. The therapist could have feel attacked by this.
Or
annihilated. So they need to be pretty grounded and strong in themselves, wouldn't they?
Yeah. So if they feel they've got any counter-transferential issues with a client, they don't do this work until they've gone to their own therapy.
It comes up time and time again, doesn't it, in this work, about making sure you're okay before you can work with clients at this type of level.
You have to.
You have to.
I mean, there's no way out of this. So what happens is then, given all those parameters I've just talked about, you ask the client to role play, say, their dad or their father, which is giving them so much grief, and you have a conversation for 5-10 minutes with the client's parental interject. So you ask them to role play in conversation with you, the parent. So you'll say things like, okay, so just imagine your father or your mother, and I'd like you to reply as your father or mother. And if you find it hard to do that, just guess. So you can have a conversation with the parent or the mother, and find out what was the purpose of some of this processes which have been so damaging to the client. Now, what you're going to find out is you're going to have a parent who is probably going to be quite, well, in cases a lot of people suffer from self-esteem, quite belligerent, or saying they did this for the best interest perhaps of the client. And, there's another 2 caveats here. Let's go back. You have to know your client well, because, you might just find a crazy parental interject.
Yes.
So if you find a crazy parental interject, you stop the work.
What would a crazy parental interject look like in terms of the presentation, Bob?
They would start talking about extremely unreal episodes, or they would start to become highly, they might be highly narcissistic. They would talk as if they've got a very rigid personality disorder, maybe, and they would start berating in quite a hysterical manner the client. Say, oh, he was never any good. He was somebody I wanted to completely get out of the system, and start talking quite crazy. Then you would stop the work. And, if you didn't listen to you, stop, and you ask the client to move back, because you don't want to invite a client into that type of hell.
No, absolutely. And I think also it's really interesting that when people are in that, it's really not a, if you're thinking of a struggle, it's not a struggle someone can win. You can't, there's always that thing, isn't it? You can't win a fight with someone who's crazy. And
can't be more crazy, can you?
No, you can't. So, by rolling them back, you take it to a place where you've. I guess the phrase I want to use is got a fighting chance, Bob. And
you're protecting them.
Protecting them, yeah.
then they can then they will talk about that, or they might talk about, well, I felt crazy, and then they can start splitting out that it wasn't their craziness, it was actually their mother's or father's craziness. Because one of the big reasons for doing this work, i.e. parent interview, is the child is listening on and starts separating out from the parental processes and themselves.
Yes. And of course, what happens is that you become an ally, rather like an ally in the child's history who wasn't there. You're in their corner, aren't you?
Correct. And that's why I said right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it's very, very powerful work. And for the client to realize that they're not that destructive parent.
Yes.
And have their own identity is so amazingly healing, Rory.
Yes. Oh, I can imagine.
Amazingly healing. They suddenly realize they're not this person.
Yeah.
That they have their own unique spirit.
Yes.
And as Eric Burns said, way before the establishment in later books about this technique I'm talking about, he talked about one of the aims of TA when you work in the parent ego state, but not so much in the parent interview, it had been established then, was that the client was able to turn down the noise like a radio of the parental chatter or the parental power. But you can only do that if you realize two things. One, that you are yourself and you're not the parent.
Yes.
Secondly, that you've got power to be able to do that, and you'll do that with the ally of the therapist. Now, all this has to be done in the transferential process, of course. We are talking about extreme nuances of psychotherapy here, but the idea of revisiting the parental ego state through a parental interview so that the client listening on can separate out is very, very important. And the other thing which I quite like very much about parent interview is you often, the client might start to feel some compassion for the parent. So you see what happens, Rory, is it's another aspect of this technique for the therapist, the TA therapist, that they're heading towards the child or the vulnerable part of the parental interject that actually needs therapy themselves but never had it.
Yeah.
So you're actually starting to work with, not quite healing, but you're really getting to the vulnerable part of the parent, and the client listening on may, for the first time, start to see the disturbance or start to have compassion for that part of themselves.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's almost like at some point working with two people. You're working in the here and now with the client, but in the there and then with the parent ego state. Yeah, sounds fascinating work, Bob.
It is, and people don't do this work, and for people listening on, till they've had many hours clinical experience.
Yes,
many hours clinical experience, because it's highly sophisticated work. Really, I'm doing this video really to explain that how to work with the parent, because there's so much written on how to work with the child ego state. We can't really leave the parent out.
No, and I think it's interesting that you, before you decide to go down this road, you need to understand where you are, because you could be taking on, let's face it, a monster.
Yeah, and you need to be able to have done your own therapy. You need to understand your own parent ego state as well. And we've said it many times, and you're right, Roy, we need to have done our own therapy. And this is highly, highly sophisticated work. People will not do until they've done 500 hours, 500 hours easy clinical work, because it takes a lot of courage. You need to know yourself really well.
Yeah. It sounds fascinating, Bob, and I really do hear that perhaps not every TA therapist, depending on their experience, would go down this road. This is really advanced practitioner work.
Yeah, absolutely not. A lot of TA therapists perhaps only stop on what we call two-chair technique.
Yes.
Visit different ego states quite quickly, but actually to ask somebody to stay for 10 minutes in the parent ego state so you can talk to them, so you can get to the child in the parent, so the client can feel some power and separation. Wow, that's That's the advanced TA therapist.
Mm. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And as Bob said, this isn't either for the faint-hearted or for the not so experienced, because the key thing here is protection. You're really going into harm's way here, aren't you?
You are. And also protect, and you asked a very good question right at the beginning, which I thought was really fascinating, when you talk about the danger to the therapist. Mm. And the more we talk about this, I start thinking we're not just talking about protection of the client, which is the most important thing.
Yes.
But, we also need to protect ourselves. So if we've got some identification with that toxic parent in the client, and we start to interview that toxic parent, we may actually go into a counter-transferential realm ourselves and not be able to carry on in an adult fashion with the client in front of us.
Yes, it sounds like very, very precise and very intricate is the word I want to use, intricate work, because there's so many variables to consider here, isn't there?
Yeah, I learned how to do, I really am going to give a plug to my mentor here, who was somebody I really, really, as you know, meant so much to me, and taught me this work. And I had to watch it, really. I know I'm attempting to describe this on an audio here. I hope my viewers will pardon the sophistication here, and if I'm not describing it very accurately, or it's not really TA made simple in a way. But that's Richard Erskine.
Yeah.
He taught me. I watched him do parent interviews. So I learned the clinical methodology, how to do that from him. But he always emphasized, like you are actually here, protection for your clients, and therapy if there's any hint of identification with that parent.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think that really is very straightforward, Bob. I think anybody watching this would get a strong sense of the reason that you would do a parents interview, and also a consideration about the experience, both clinically and the experience of yourself, that needs to be considered before you do that.
Yeah, and that's one last thing. I talked about psychosis. You can't always predict if a psychotic parental interject pops up. What you can predict, Roy, is if somebody's level of disturbance before you go into this. So in other words, you would not do this type of work with a client that was disturbed, in other words, out of touch with reality, because you could almost guess that a out of touch reality parental interject might pop up. So you wouldn't do it with someone who's disturbed. They would have to have quite a strong capacity of adult.
Yes, and I guess also you're going right up to the line, aren't you? Of right up to that literal borderline between neurosis and psychosis, because you could literally push a client across, couldn't you, if you weren't careful?
Yeah, you must not. You must really know the client. Protection is the name of the game, and the person has to have a pretty good access or capacity to their adults, so they're in the world of the neurotic, in the world of the worried well, and not in the world of personality disorders.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that there's going to be a lot of work done prior to this. You talked about 9 months in therapy. Yeah. So the client has to be brought to a place where they're strong enough to be able to withstand.
Correct. That's a way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, Bob, as always, it's a real pleasure listening to your wisdom and skill. And you do really explain these concepts really, really simply. So what's our next one going to be?
Well, I hinted it last time, but I did want to do the parent because it would have been out of sync not to. We're going to go on to what I said last time, the different schools and approaches of TA.
Wow. So tune in for that. And let's have some comments in the comments bar below. If you're a follower of TA or want to ask any questions, pop them in, and Bob will have a look and answer them if he can. Yes. And as always, Bob, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ollie.